Welcome to Hauntales, where darkest stories come alive. I know many of you tune into these tales to drift off to sleep, so settle in, relax, and get comfortable. Whether you're lying in bed or curled up on the couch, let the whispers of these chilling encounters carry you away. Before we begin tonight's story, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more spine-tingling tales, and let me know in the comments where are you listening from, and what time is it. I love seeing how far our stories travel. For the best experience, use your headphones, close your eyes, and let every word sink deep into your mind. Now we begin our stories for tonight. Story 1. The Endless Drive. It started like any other road trip. A simple drive, a journey from Ashford to Wichita, and a familiar route that I'd taken more times than I could count. But this time something was different, something was terribly, horribly different. It was later than I wanted it to be, and I'd been driving for nearly 6 hours. I had one more stretch of road before I reached my destination. I was on my way to see my sister, who had called earlier that day, saying that she needed me. Her voice had sounded off, panicked, but she wouldn't tell me why. "Just come," she had said. "I'll explain everything when you get here." I had driven through this stretch of highway before a lonely, narrow road that cut through the forests, weaving its way between tall trees and plunging into darkness after every bend. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and my headlights seemed to barely pierce the darkness ahead. The radio crackled with static before going completely silent, leaving me alone with the hum of the engine and the rhythmic sound of the tires on the asphalt. I was fine, I told myself. I'd driven this road countless times. But something in the air felt wrong, heavy, like the night itself was pressing in on me. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 11:45 p.m. The road stretched ahead, empty and endless. I saw the figure for the first time about 30 miles out from my sister's place. A lone silhouette standing by the side of the road, barely visible in the dim glow of my headlights. I slowed down instinctively, squinting to get a better look. It was a man, or at least I thought it was a man, tall and still, with his back to me, dressed in dark clothes. There was something unnerving about him. Something that sent a chill through my body. His stance was unnatural, rigid, as if he were frozen in place. He wasn't hitchhiking, not waving for a ride, just standing there motionless. I drove past him, my eyes locked on the rearview mirror. As I sped away, I felt a strange unease creep up my spine, but I shook it off. People did strange things in the middle of nowhere, I reasoned. Maybe he was lost or waiting for someone. I kept driving, trying to focus on the road ahead, but the image of the figure lingered in my mind like a dark shadow. 15 minutes later, I saw him again. This time, he was standing closer to the road, his face still obscured by the darkness, but there was no mistaking it. It was the same man, the same rigid stance, the same unsettling stillness. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I glanced at the clock again. 11:45 p.m., the same time as before. No, that wasn't possible. I had been driving for at least 15 minutes, and yet the clock hadn't moved. My stomach turned with a mix of confusion and fear. I rubbed my eyes, telling myself I was just tired, that maybe the clock was malfunctioning. But the figure, that couldn't be a mistake. I didn't slow down this time. I pressed harder on the gas, desperate to put distance between me and him. The road stretched on, twisting and turning through the dense forest, and for a while I convinced myself it was all in my head. But then I saw him again. Closer this time. Almost as if he was waiting for me, expecting me. I kept driving, faster now, the hum of the engine growing louder as I pushed the car to its limits. I wanted to get off this road, wanted to get away from the figure that seemed to be following me, but the road wasn't cooperating. No matter how far I drove, I kept seeing him, again and again, standing by the side of the road, closer each time. The clock still read 11:45 p.m. I slammed my hand against the dashboard in frustration, but nothing changed. My phone had no signal, the GPS wasn't working, and the gas gauge was slowly creeping toward empty. I felt trapped, like the road had become some kind of endless loop, a nightmare that I couldn't escape. And then something changed. I saw a sign for a detour up ahead. It pointed to an old, narrow road that cut through the forest, leading to a small town I didn't recognize. I had never seen that sign before. I should have ignored it, should have kept driving, but some instinct I can't explain told me to take the turn. I veered off the main road, my headlights illuminating the dense trees as I made my way down the narrow path. The figure was gone, at least for now, and I felt a small sense of relief wash over me. But that relief didn't last long. After what felt like hours, I came across an old, run-down gas station, its flickering lights casting eerie shadows across the pavement. It was the first sign of life I had seen in miles, and despite the unsettling feeling gnawing at my gut, I pulled in. The place was deserted, no attendant, no cars, just the creaking sound of the wind and the hum of the fluorescent lights. I got out of the car, glancing around uneasily. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if something was watching me from the shadows. I walked over to the pump and tried to fill up my tank, but the pump wasn't working. I cursed under my breath, looking around for any sign of help, but the station was empty. And then I saw it. In the distance, just beyond the edge of the station's light, the figure was there, standing still, watching me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. He was closer than ever before, close enough that I could almost make out his face, pale, blank, and emotionless. I jumped back into the car, my hands shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I sped out of the gas station, leaving the figure behind. But no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me, still following me. The road led me into a small, forgotten town. The buildings were old and decrepit, their windows dark and lifeless. There were no streetlights, no cars, no signs of life. It was like the town had been abandoned for decades. I pulled into a parking lot in front of what looked like an old diner, hoping to find anyone who could help me. But as I stepped out of the car, the eerie silence pressed down on me, suffocating in its intensity. I walked up to the diner's door and pushed it open, the sound of the creaking hinges echoing through the empty street. Inside, the place was a time capsule from another era. The tables were set, the jukebox stood in the corner, but there was no one there. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I turned, my heart racing, but there was nothing. Just the empty diner and the sound of my own breathing. I backed out of the diner, my mind racing, and that's when I saw him again, standing in the middle of the street, waiting for me. I ran back to my car, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel his presence closing in on me, suffocating me. As I sped away from the town, the road twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense. The trees grew taller, the shadows darker, and time seemed to stretch and warp around me. The clock on my dashboard still read 11:45 p.m., but I knew I had been driving for hours. I started to understand what was happening. This road, this figure, wasn't real, or at least not in the way I had thought. I was trapped in some kind of loop, a nightmare that kept repeating itself, no matter how far I drove. And then it hit me, the figure wasn't following me. He was leading me. Leading me to something I didn't want to face. I don't know how long I drove, but eventually the road ended. I found myself at the edge of a cliff, overlooking a dark, endless void. There was nowhere left to go. The figure stood at the edge of the cliff, waiting for me. I got out of the car, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I was supposed to do, didn't know how to escape this nightmare. But something deep inside me told me that this was it, the final confrontation. As I approached the figure, I could finally see his face. He wasn't a man, he was something else, something ancient and terrifying. His eyes were empty, his skin pale and lifeless, and his mouth twisted into a cruel smile. "You were never meant to leave," he whispered, his voice echoing in the darkness. "This road belongs to me." I stepped back, my mind racing, but it was too late. The ground beneath me began to crumble, and before I could react, I was falling into the void, into the endless darkness. I woke up in my car, parked on the side of the road, the morning sun shining through the trees. My heart was still racing, my hands shaking, but the figure was gone. I checked the clock on the dashboard, 6 a.m. I had made it. I don't know how I escaped, don't know if I'll ever understand what happened on that road, but one thing is certain, I'll never drive that highway again. And if you ever find yourself on a lonely road late at night and you see a figure standing by the side of the road, don't stop. Don't look back. Just keep driving. I kept driving, the road stretching endlessly ahead, twisting like a serpent into the dark unknown. The clock on the dashboard still read 11:45 p.m. unmoving, like a constant reminder that time had abandoned me. It was then, amid the suffocating silence, that my thoughts began to drift, and I found myself reflecting on how I had ended up here, on this cursed road, in this bizarre, incomprehensible nightmare. The mind does strange things when it's faced with the inexplicable. As I stared into the black void ahead, I couldn't help but think back to the choices I had made, the turns in my life that had brought me here. My sister's call earlier that day had felt like a lifeline, something to pull me away from the monotony of my existence, a routine that had become suffocating in its predictability. Maybe that's why I hadn't hesitated to get in the car and drive, even though her voice had sounded off, distant, like she was hiding something. Had I missed the signs? The little clues scattered throughout my life that maybe, just maybe, everything had been leading to this moment? I thought back to all the times I had ignored my gut feelings, all the warning signs that I had brushed off as irrational fears. I'd always prided myself on being logical, practical. I wasn't one to believe in ghosts or curses or anything that couldn't be explained by science. But here I was, trapped in something that defied explanation, something that laughed in the face of logic. The figure on the side of the road, why did it feel so familiar? Why did its presence shake me to my core in ways I couldn't understand? The more I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me. What if this wasn't just some random event? What if this road, this figure, was a manifestation of something deeper, something inside me that I had refused to confront for years? As the road unfolded beneath my tires, a realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't just running from the figure, I was running from myself, from the doubts and fears that had been festering in the corners of my mind. For so long, I had buried them beneath the surface, pretending they didn't exist. But here, on this endless road, there was no escaping them. I glanced at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes were tired, sunken, as if they had aged overnight. I looked like a stranger, a version of myself that I didn't recognize. Who was I, really? Had I become so consumed by the routine of my life that I had forgotten what it meant to truly feel, to truly fear. I thought about my sister again. Was I driving toward her because I genuinely wanted to help her, or was it because I needed an excuse to escape the monotony of my own life? Had I really come all this way for her, or was it just an attempt to avoid facing the emptiness that had been creeping into my soul for years? The road, the figure, the endless loop, it was all a reflection of me. My fears, my regrets, my inability to confront the things that truly mattered. I had been living on autopilot for so long, going through the motions, never stopping to reflect on where I was headed or why. But now there was no avoiding it. This road, this nightmare, it was forcing me to face the darkest parts of myself, the parts I had tried so hard to ignore. Story 2: The Abyss of Blackthorn Cliff. The train rattled along the coastal tracks, the rhythmic clatter of steel on steel, monotonous backdrop to the storm building over the horizon. Ethan Carter gazed out the window, watching the waves crash violently against the jagged rocks far below. His thoughts were elsewhere, preoccupied with the assignment that had drawn him to this remote corner of England. Blackthorn Cliff. He had first heard about it years ago, a passing mention in a geological journal regarding the strange seismic activity reported in the region. Most dismissed it as nothing more than an unstable fault line, but there was something about the place that had stayed with him. And when his department received a request from the local council to study the increasing geological disturbances, Ethan had volunteered without hesitation. His colleagues had questioned his eagerness, especially given Blackthorn's notorious reputation. The town had a dark history, shrouded in superstition and rumors of disappearances, ghostly sightings, and strange occurrences. But Ethan was a man of science. Legends didn't scare him. He was here to find facts, to prove that there was a logical explanation behind the eerie tales. As the train rounded a bend, the cliff came into view, towering above the sea like a massive, dark sentinel. It seemed to stretch on forever, its sheer face disappearing into the low-hanging fog that clung to the coast. Ethan felt a strange chill as he gazed at it, a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "Blackthorn's got a way of creeping up on you," a voice said beside him. Ethan turned to see an old man sitting across the aisle, his wrinkled face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His eyes were dark and piercing, and there was a knowing smile on his lips. "You here for the cliffs, aren't you?" Ethan nodded. "Geological research." The old man chuckled softly. "That's what they all say at first." Before Ethan could ask him what he meant, the train began to slow as it approached the small station of Blackthorn. The old man stood, tipping his hat slightly. "Good luck to you, lad. Mind the fog." And with that cryptic warning, he was gone, disappearing into the crowd of disembarking passengers. Ethan grabbed his bag and stepped off the train into the cold, misty air. The platform was nearly deserted, save for a few locals who looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. He quickly made his way to the only inn in town, a small, weathered building called the Blackthorn Arms, run by an elderly woman named Mrs. Hale. She greeted him with a warm, albeit nervous smile, but as soon as he mentioned his work on the cliffs, her demeanor shifted. "You'll want to be careful up there," she warned as she handed him his room key. "Blackthorn Cliff isn't like other places. It has a way of getting under your skin." Ethan smiled politely, though he was starting to tire of the ominous warnings. "I'm sure I'll be fine." Mrs. Hale simply nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line, Just don't stay too long. The next morning, Ethan set out for the cliffs, armed with his equipment and a determination to debunk the myths that surrounded the place. The sky was overcast, casting a gray pallor over the town as he made his way toward the trail that led to the cliffs. As he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every so often, he would glance over his shoulder, only to find the street behind him empty. The locals avoided making eye contact, and more than once he caught a glimpse of someone quickly turning away as if to avoid speaking to him. By the time he reached the trailhead, a thick fog had rolled in from the sea, obscuring the path ahead. Ethan hesitated for a moment, remembering the old man's warning from the train station. But he pushed the thought aside and pressed on, his boots crunching on the gravel as he ascended the steep path. The fog grew denser the higher he climbed, until he could barely see more than a few feet in front of him. The air was heavy with moisture, and the only sound was the distant roar of the waves crashing against the rocks below. And then, faintly, he heard it. A whisper. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but the sound persisted, growing louder with each step he took. It was indistinct, like the murmuring of voices just beyond the edge of hearing. Ethan stopped, his heart pounding in his chest, and listened. Ethan. His name, carried on the wind, sent a chill down his spine. He spun around, searching for the source, but there was no one there. The fog pressed in around him, suffocating, disorienting. He shook his head, telling himself it was just his imagination. The fog was playing tricks on him, distorting sounds and making him hear things that weren't there. He needed to focus on his work. But as he continued up the path, the whispers followed him, growing louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from all directions, yet from nowhere at all. His name, over and over, like a chant. Ethan. Ethan. By the time he reached the top of the cliff, his nerves were frayed. The fog was so thick now that he could barely make out the edge of the precipice a few feet away. He set up his equipment, trying to ignore the strange feeling that had settled in the pit of his stomach. He was here to work, to find answers, not to be frightened by ghost stories. But as he began taking measurements, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The air was heavy, oppressive, and the whispers had become a constant background noise, like a low, persistent hum. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the cliff, barely visible through the fog. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just there, watching him. Slowly, he reached for his camera, trying to capture the image, but as soon as he lifted it to his eye, the figure was gone. The cliff was empty. Ethan lowered the camera, his hands trembling. He hadn't imagined it. He couldn't have. Someone or something had been there, watching him. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet shifted, a low rumble echoing up from the depths of the cliff. Ethan stumbled, barely managing to keep his balance as the earth shook. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to send a surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins. He quickly packed up his equipment, his heart racing. The seismic activity was stronger than he had anticipated, and the whispers, the figure, they were just distractions. He needed to get back to town to analyze the data. But as he turned to leave, he heard it again. Ethan. This time the voice was clear, unmistakable. It was coming from the cliff. Back at the inn, Ethan sat at the small desk in his room staring at the data on his laptop. The readings were strange, inconsistent with what he had expected. The seismic activity was irregular, almost as if it were being triggered by something unnatural. But that wasn't possible. There had to be a logical explanation. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The whispers still echoed in his mind, and the image of the figure at the cliff's edge refused to leave him. He couldn't focus, couldn't think straight. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Hale stood in the doorway, her expression grave. "May I come in?" Ethan nodded, gesturing for her to sit. She settled into the chair across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a moment she said nothing, just looked at him with a mixture of pity and fear. "I know why you're here," she finally said, "but you won't find what you're looking for in your machines." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Hale sighed, her gaze drifting to the window, where the fog still hung heavy over the town. "The cliffs. They're cursed. Always have been. The locals know better than to go up there, but outsiders, they never listen." Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but she held up a hand. "I know you don't believe me. I didn't believe it either when I first came here. But I've seen things, heard things that can't be explained." She paused, her eyes distant, as if she were reliving a memory. "They say the cliffs were once a sacred place, long before the town was built. A place where the ancient tribes would offer sacrifices to the sea gods, but something went wrong. The spirits of the dead were never at rest. Now they linger there, trapped between worlds, waiting for someone to set them free." Ethan shook his head. "That's just a legend." Mrs. Hale's eyes snapped back to him, sharp and intense. "It's more than a legend, Mr. Carter. People have disappeared up there, good people. And those who do come back, they're never the same." Ethan felt a chill crawl down his spine. "What do you mean?" "They see things, hear things, things that aren't there. The cliffs. They get inside your head, make you doubt what's real and what's not. And the longer you stay, the worse it gets." Ethan's mind flashed back to the figure he had seen at the edge of the cliff, the whispers that had followed him down the path. Could it really be more than just his imagination? "I'm telling you this because I don't want to see another good man lost to that place," Mrs. Hale said quietly. "Whatever you're looking for up there, it's not worth the risk." Ethan sat in silence for a long moment, his thoughts racing. He had come here to study the seismic activity, to find a logical explanation for the strange occurrences. But now he wasn't so sure. Against Mrs. Hale's advice, Ethan returned to the cliff the next day. This time he was determined to stay longer, to gather more data. The whispers were louder now, more persistent, but he tried to block them out, focusing on his work. He had set up additional sensors along the cliff's edge, hoping to capture more concrete evidence of the seismic anomalies. But as the day wore on, the fog thickened, and the whispers grew more insistent, more personal. They weren't just calling his name anymore. They were speaking to him, telling him things. Things about his past, his regrets, his fears. And then, just as he was about to pack up and leave, the ground shifted beneath his feet again. This time, it was stronger, more violent. The cliff trembled, rocks breaking loose and tumbling into the sea below. Ethan stumbled back, his heart racing. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices all speaking at once, overwhelming his senses. And then, through the fog, he saw it again. The figure. This time, it was closer, standing just a few feet away from him. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and empty. She wore a tattered white dress, the fabric stained with mud and seawater. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he stared at her, unable to move. The woman raised a hand, pointing toward the edge of the cliff. "Come," she whispered, her voice soft but commanding. Ethan shook his head, fear gripping him. "No, I can't." The woman's expression didn't change, but her voice grew sharper, more urgent. "Come." Ethan took a step back, his mind racing. He didn't understand what was happening, didn't know if the woman was real or just another figment of his imagination. But the fear was real. He could feel it in his bones and the way his heart pounded in his chest. Suddenly, the ground beneath him gave way, the earth crumbling as the cliff began to collapse. Ethan lunged forward, grabbing hold of a nearby rock as the ground disappeared beneath him. He could feel the pull of the void below, the wind howling in his ears as the sea roared far below. The woman stood at the edge of the cliff, watching him, her expression unreadable. "Come," she whispered one last time. And then, she was gone. The fog lifted, and Ethan found himself alone on the cliff, his body trembling from the adrenaline. The whispers had stopped, the air still and silent. But he knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. In the days that followed, Ethan became consumed with the cliff. He could think of nothing else. The whispers haunted him, even in his sleep, and the image of the woman in white was burned into his mind. He returned to the cliff again and again, each time staying longer, each time feeling the pull of the abyss grow stronger. The locals avoided him now, their eyes filled with pity and fear whenever he passed. Mrs. Hale had tried to convince him to leave, but he couldn't. He was too far gone. The cliff had become a part of him, and he couldn't escape its grip. One night, as he sat alone in his room, staring at the data on his laptop, he realized something. The seismic activity wasn't natural. It wasn't random. It was being caused by something beneath the cliff. Something ancient, something powerful. Something that was trying to break free. Ethan's heart raced as he pieced it together. The whispers, the woman, the collapses, they were all connected. The cliff was a doorway, a threshold between worlds, and something on the other side was trying to cross over. But it needed him to do it. The realization sent a shiver down his spine, but it also filled him with a strange sense of purpose. He had to stop it. He had to close the door before it was too late. The next morning, Ethan returned to the cliff one last time. The fog was thicker than ever, so dense that he could barely see the path ahead. The whispers were louder now, a constant hum in the back of his mind, but he ignored them, focusing on the task at hand. He had brought tools with him, supplies to seal the fault line and stabilize the cliff. It was risky, but it was the only way. As he reached the edge of the cliff, the ground began to tremble again, the earth shifting beneath his feet. But this time, Ethan was ready. He set to work, his hands moving quickly as he hammered stakes into the ground, securing the fault line. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, but he pushed them aside, focusing on the task. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath him. Ethan fell, tumbling down the side of the cliff, his body slamming into rocks as he plummeted toward the sea below. He hit the water with a bone-jarring impact, the cold shock stealing the breath from his lungs. For a moment, everything went black. When he came to, he was lying on a narrow ledge, the waves crashing against the rocks below. His body ached, his head spinning, but he was alive. And then he saw her. The woman in white, standing on the ledge above him, her eyes hollow and dark. She smiled, a cold, empty smile. "Come," she whispered. Ethan shook his head, his body trembling. "No, I can't." But the woman only smiled wider, her eyes glinting with a strange, dark light. "You already have, and you know for an enig." The ground beneath Ethan's feet shifted, and suddenly he was falling again, plummeting into the abyss below. When Ethan woke, he was lying on a cold, hard surface, the air thick with the stench of decay. He sat up, his body aching, and looked around. He was in a cavern, deep beneath the cliffs. The walls were slick with moisture, and the only light came from a faint, eerie glow that seemed to emanate from the rock itself. The whispers were louder here, almost deafening, but they were no longer just voices. They were shapes, shadows, figures moving in the darkness, their hollow eyes watching him. Ethan stumbled to his feet, his heart racing. He didn't know where he was or how he had gotten here, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't alone. The woman in white appeared before him, her body translucent, her eyes dark and hollow. "This is where it ends," she whispered, her voice cold and distant. Ethan backed away, his mind racing. "What do you want?" The woman smiled, a cruel, empty smile. "I want what has always been mine." Before he could react, the ground beneath him began to tremble, the walls of the cavern shaking as the earth shifted. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and the figures in the darkness began to move, their hollow eyes fixed on Ethan. He turned and ran, his heart pounding in his chest, as the cavern collapsed around him. But no matter how fast he ran, the whispers followed him, growing louder, more insistent. And then, just as he reached the edge of the cavern, the ground gave way beneath him and he fell. Ethan Carter was never seen again. The town of Blackthorn remained shrouded in mystery, its dark history buried beneath layers of superstition and fear. The cliffs still stand, towering above the sea, their jagged edges disappearing into the fog. And the whispers never stopped. They still echoed through the town, carried on the wind, calling out to those who dare to listen, calling them to the abyss. And those who answer never return. The town of Blackthorn fell into silence after Ethan Carter's disappearance. Days turned into weeks, and still, no one spoke of what had happened. It was as if the town had collectively agreed to forget, to bury Ethan's story along with the many who had vanished before him. But forgetting was never an option. The whispers remained. They haunted the night, drifting through the fog like lost souls seeking something or someone. People spoke of hearing their names carried on the wind, or worse, the voices of loved ones who had long since disappeared, calling to them from the cliffs. No one ventured up the path anymore, not even the bravest or the most foolish. The cliffs had taken too much, but the fear in Blackthorn was a quiet one, lurking just below the surface of everyday life. The fear that the cliffs weren't done, that someday they would come for more. Months after Ethan's disappearance, a small group of strangers arrived in Blackthorn. They weren't tourists, though they didn't exactly seem like locals either. They were a team, 2 men and a woman clad in rugged gear, their faces grim and focused. They called themselves paranormal investigators, and they came with equipment meant to track the unexplainable. They had heard the stories of the cliffs, of the disappearances, and they wanted to find out the truth. The townspeople were wary of the group, refusing to offer much help. But one name kept coming up in hushed whispers at the local pub, Miss Hale. She was the only one who knew what had really happened to Ethan, the only one who had tried to warn him. The team made their way to her cottage, knocking on the weathered wooden door. After a long pause, it creaked open. Miss Hale stood there, her eyes sharp but tired. "I told him not to go back," she said before they could speak. Her voice was hoarse, as if she'd been waiting a long time for this moment, but he didn't listen. The lead investigator, a man named Richard, nodded slowly. "We know, Mom, but we're not here to repeat his mistake. We're here to understand what's happening up there." Miss Hale's gaze hardened. "You think you can understand something like that? The cliffs, they're older than all of us, older than anything we can comprehend." "But we have equipment," the woman on the team, Jennifer, began, but Miss Hale cut her off. "It's not about equipment. It's about what they want. The cliffs take what they choose, and they won't stop until they're satisfied." Richard glanced at his team, uncertainty flickering in his eyes, but he pressed on. What did they want from Ethan? Mrs. Hale's face softened with something that almost looked like pity. They wanted him, just like they'll want you if you go up there. Despite Mrs. Hale's warning, the team was determined. They believed they could outsmart the Cliffs, that their tools and technology could measure what others had only feared. Armed with thermal cameras, audio recorders, and motion sensors, they made their way to the Cliffs at dawn when the fog was heaviest. The path up was eerily silent. No birds, no wind, just the soft crunch of their boots on the gravelly trail. The fog wrapped around them, thick and disorienting, swallowing their surroundings until they could barely see a few feet ahead. "Are you sure we're still on the path?" Jennifer asked, her voice tense. Richard checked the GPS device in his hand. "We're still on track. Just keep moving forward." But even the GPS seemed to struggle. The signal flickered, cutting in and out as if something was interfering with it. Richard frowned, but didn't say anything. The whispers began softly at first, so faint that the team thought it was just the wind, but as they climbed higher, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. "Did you hear that?" John, the second man on the team, asked, his voice barely a whisper itself. Jennifer nodded, her eyes wide. "It's voices." Richard paused, glancing around. "It's just an auditory anomaly. Probably the wind or the fog distorting sound." But the voices were clearer now, unmistakable. They weren't random noises, they were words. Were fragments of sentences, names. Jennifer's name. She froze, her blood turning to ice as she heard it again, whispered in the same familiar tone she'd heard all her life. Her mother's voice. Seld. "Jennifer, come here." Her heart pounded in her chest. "Richard, I swear that was." "It's not real," Richard interrupted, his voice firm but shaky. "Focus, we're almost at the top." But the voices wouldn't stop. They were calling each of them now, each voice personal, intimate, pulling at their deepest fears and memories. And then, as they reached the top, they saw it. The figure. The same woman in white that Ethan had described, standing at the edge of the cliff, her dress fluttering in the breeze despite the stillness of the air. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow and dark, just as Ethan had seen. For a moment, no one moved. "Is she real?" John asked, his voice barely audible. Before anyone could answer, the ground beneath their feet shifted violently. The cliff trembled, rocks breaking loose and tumbling into the abyss below. The woman in white raised her hand, pointing directly at them. "Come." The ground gave another shudder, sending the team stumbling backward. The woman remained still, her gaze fixed on them, her hollow eyes gleaming with something dark and ancient. Jennifer was the first to react, pulling out her thermal camera and pointing it toward the figure, but the display showed nothing, no heat signature, no trace of life. She's not alive," Jennifer whispered, backing away, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "That's impossible," Richard muttered, but even he was starting to doubt. The readings made no sense, and the whispers, they were growing louder, more urgent. "Let's get out of here," John said, his voice panicked. "We've seen enough. We need to go." But before they could move, the fog thickened, swirling around them like a living thing. The whispers became a deafening roar, their names called over and over again. Suddenly, Jennifer screamed. The woman in white was closer now, standing directly in front of her. Her face was a twisted mask of sorrow and rage, her hollow eyes boring into Jennifer's. "Come," the woman whispered again, her voice low and guttural. Jennifer's body jerked forward as if pulled by an invisible force, her feet moving against her will. "Jennifer, stop," Richard shouted, grabbing her arm, but she couldn't hear him. The pull was too strong. She was being dragged toward the edge of the cliff. John rushed to help, but as soon as he touched her, he too was pulled toward the abyss, his body lurching forward as if caught in a current. "No," Richard yelled, fighting against the force that threatened to drag them all into the darkness, but it was too late. The ground beneath them collapsed, and the world tilted. They were falling, the screams of his team echoing in the air as the abyss swallowed them whole. When Richard awoke, he was lying in the same cavern Ethan had found, deep beneath the cliffs. The air was thick with the stench of rot, and the ground was slick with moisture. The whispers were gone, but the silence was worse, oppressive, suffocating. He sat up slowly, his body aching, his mind foggy. Jennifer and John were nowhere to be seen. He was alone. But not for long. The woman in white appeared before him, her translucent form flickering in the dim light of the cavern. Her eyes were no longer hollow. They were full of darkness, an ancient, malevolent force that had been waiting for centuries. "This is where it ends," she whispered, her voice cold and final. Richard staggered to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do you want from me?" The woman smiled, a cruel, empty smile. "I want what I've always wanted." She raised her hand, and the ground beneath Richard began to tremble. The figures in the darkness, the shadows moved closer, their hollow eyes fixed on him. "You've come to the abyss," she said softly, "and now the abyss will take you." The ground split open, and the last thing Richard saw before the darkness consumed him was the woman's empty, lifeless smile. The town of Blackthorn remained quiet in the aftermath of the investigation team's disappearance. The cliffs, once again, had taken their due, but the whispers never stopped. To this day, they call out to anyone who dares venture too close to the cliffs. They call out in the voices of those lost to the abyss, luring more souls to the edge, where the void waits, patient and hungry. And as long as the cliffs stand, the abyss will remain, whispering its dark promises to those foolish enough to listen. Story 3: The Whispering Lady. I moved to the small town of Eldridge under the pretense of starting fresh, leaving behind the city's chaos and the memories that haunted me. Eldridge was quaint, a place where everyone knew everyone. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of pine and the distant sound of the river winding through the valley. My new home was an old Victorian house on the outskirts of town, its wooden frame creaking with history. The townsfolk were friendly but reserved, their smiles often lingering just a moment too long, as if they were holding back something unsaid. "Make sure to stay away from the old chapel," the grocery clerk advised with a slight shiver as I loaded my cart. "They say it's haunted by the Whispering Lady." I chuckled, thinking it was just local folklore, another ghost story to scare the children. I had my own ghosts to contend with, ones that whispered in my mind at night, reminding me of past mistakes. As the days turned into weeks, I tried to settle into my new routine. I took long walks through the woods behind my house, relishing the solitude and the calming sounds of nature. But one evening, as dusk settled in, I found myself wandering too far from my path, led by an inexplicable compulsion. In the fading light, I stumbled upon the old chapel. It stood lonely and forgotten, cloaked in shadows. I hesitated, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, but curious enough to step inside. The door creaked open, revealing dust motes dancing in the dim light filtering through broken stained glass. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and something metallic. As I moved deeper into the chapel, I heard it a soft whisper, like a gentle breeze brushing against my ear. "Help me." I froze, my heart racing. The voice was feminine, laced with despair. I strained to listen, hoping for clarity, but it faded into the silence, leaving only the echo of my own breath. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. But there was no answer, only the soft rustle of leaves outside. Later that night, I couldn't shake the memory of the whisper. It nagged at me like an itch I couldn't reach. I decided to ask around about the chapel and the Whispering Lady. The next day, I visited the local library, a quaint building filled with the scent of old books. The librarian, a kind but weary woman named Mrs. Finch, raised an eyebrow when I mentioned the chapel. "Ah, the Whispering Lady. It's an old story, a tragic tale," she said, her voice lowering as if she were afraid of being overheard. "A woman named Clara lived there long ago," she continued. She was the town's healer, but her methods were unconventional. People didn't trust her, and when several children went missing, she was blamed. They said she made a pact with dark forces. I leaned in closer, captivated. What happened to her? Mob mentality, I suppose. They hunted her down, dragged her to the chapel, and burned it to the ground with her inside. They say her spirit lingers, whispering for help, but no one dares to listen. Mrs. Finch's words hung heavy in the air, and I shivered despite the warm sunlight streaming through the windows. The whispers I had heard in the chapel suddenly felt more sinister. That night I lay in bed, the shadows dancing on my walls, recalling Clara's story. As the clock struck midnight, the air grew colder, and I was jolted awake by a soft whisper my name. Emily. I sat up, my heart racing. The room was dark, but the whisper was clear. A voice so intimate yet distant. It felt as though it was calling from within the walls, from the very floorboards beneath me. Emily. Come to me. I wanted to run, to escape the suffocating fear that enveloped me, but something held me in place. The whisper was melodic, almost soothing, wrapping around my mind like a lullaby. I climbed out of bed, drawn toward the chapel as if by an invisible thread. The night air was crisp and cool against my skin as I stepped outside. The moon hung low, casting an ethereal glow over the forest, illuminating my path. The whispers grew louder with each step, leading me through the trees and towards the chapel. The building loomed before me, dark and foreboding, but the whispers beckoned me closer. The door creaked open as I stepped inside, and the cold air hit me like a wave. The chapel was more imposing at night, the broken stained glass casting eerie shadows on the walls. Emily. I felt the chill creep down my spine. Who are you? I called out, my voice echoing in the silence. I need your help, the voice whispered, a hint of desperation in its tone. I'm trapped. Trapped? How? I asked, feeling an odd mixture of fear and empathy. Find the heart, the voice urged. Find the heart and set me free. What heart? I asked, my breath hitching as I felt the air around me grow heavier. But the whispers faded, leaving only silence. I stood there, heart pounding, grappling with the sense that something ancient and powerful lingered within these walls. The next day, I returned to the library, determined to uncover more about Clara and the chapel. Mrs. Finch was busy, so I began digging through old records and newspaper clippings. I discovered an old journal belonging to Clara, filled with sketches and notes about her healing practices. The final entry was a frantic scrawl, filled with despair. They won't listen. I can't help them if they don't understand. The heart is the key. They must know. My curiosity piqued, and I felt the urgency of the whispers in my mind. What did Clara mean by the heart? Was it a literal heart, or something more symbolic? I decided to explore the chapel further. That night, armed with a flashlight, I returned, determined to search for any clues. As I entered, the air was electric, charged with anticipation. I scanned the room, focusing on the altar at the far end. As I approached, I noticed the floorboards were loose. Kneeling down, I pried one up to reveal a small compartment beneath. My heart raced as I reached inside, pulling out a weathered wooden box. I opened the box to find a heart-shaped stone, intricately carved with symbols I couldn't recognize. It pulsed with an energy that sent shivers through me. The whispers returned, swirling around me, growing louder, more insistent. Bring it to me, the voice urged. Bring it to the altar. I hesitated but felt an undeniable pull toward the altar. As I placed the stone on the cold surface, a surge of energy coursed through the air. The temperature dropped dramatically, and shadows flickered around me. "Thank you," the voice sighed, and the room began to tremble. "Now I can finally be free." Suddenly, the shadows morphed, forming a figure. Clara stood before me, her translucent form flickering like a dying flame. Her eyes were dark pools of despair, and her mouth twisted into a sorrowful smile. "Thank you for releasing my heart," she whispered, her voice echoing through the chapel. "But I need more than this." "What do you need?" I gasped, fear coursing through me. "Revenge." Before I could respond, the atmosphere shifted. The shadows thickened, wrapping around me like a cocoon. I struggled against their grip, but it was no use. Clara's presence enveloped me, drowning out my thoughts. "Join me, Emily. Together we can exact the revenge I crave. They deserve to suffer for what they did to me." I fought back against the darkness creeping into my mind. "No, I can't do that." "You must." Clara's voice became a low growl, filled with fury. "They took everything from me. You want to help? Help me make them pay." Suddenly the shadows released me, and I stumbled backward, gasping for breath. The chapel was still, save for the flickering shadows that danced in the corners. "No," I pleaded, shaking my head. "I won't help you." Clara's form flickered, her face contorting with rage. "Then you'll suffer the same fate as them." I bolted from the chapel, my heart racing as I raced back to town. The whispers had quieted, but I could still feel Clara's anger trailing behind me. I needed to warn the townsfolk, to tell them what had happened and what Clara had become. I found a small gathering at the local pub, the townspeople sharing stories over drinks. I burst in, breathless and panicked. "Listen, Clara's spirit is angry. She wants revenge." They all turned to look at me, their faces a mix of disbelief and concern. "You shouldn't have gone to that chapel," one man muttered, shaking his head. "She'll come for us," I insisted, but they only laughed, dismissing my fears as hysteria. That night, I locked myself in my home, fear clawing at my insides. I could hear whispers outside, echoing through the darkness, filling the air with dread. The next morning, I awoke to find the town in chaos. Several townsfolk had vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but echoes of their laughter that now felt tainted. As the days passed, the disappearances continued, each more chilling than the last. The whispers grew louder, more persistent, and I knew Clara was behind it all. I had unwittingly unleashed a malevolent force upon Eldridge, and the townsfolk were paying the price. In desperation, I returned to the chapel, seeking a way to confront Clara. I needed to find a way to stop her before she took everyone. As I stepped inside, the shadows danced wildly, and the atmosphere crackled with tension. "Emily," Clara's voice hissed through the darkness. "You've come back." "I need to stop this, Clara," I shouted, feeling the fear seep into my bones. "You can't keep taking people." "Why not?" she replied, her voice laced with amusement. "They took everything from me. It's only fair they suffer." "But they didn't do anything to you," I argued, my voice trembling. "They didn't save me," she retorted, her voice rising. "And now they will pay." Suddenly the shadows lunged at me, wrapping around my legs, pulling me into the depths of darkness. I fought against them, screaming for help, but the sound was swallowed by the silence. In that moment of panic, a memory surfaced, the heart-shaped stone I had placed on the altar. It was the key to freeing Clara from her rage. If I could return it to her, perhaps I could quell the storm inside her. With renewed determination, I wrenched free from the shadows and lunged for the altar. The stone pulsed with energy, resonating with Clara's fury. I held it close to my chest, feeling its warmth. "Clara," I shouted, summoning every ounce of courage. "This doesn't have to continue. Let me help you." The shadows stilled and Clara's figure materialized before me, her face twisted with rage. "You think you can save me?" she screeched. "I can't save you unless you let me," I replied, holding the stone out toward her. "You don't have to be angry anymore." For a moment, time stood still. Clara hesitated, her expression shifting from rage to confusion. I don't want this." "Then let it go," I urged, my heart pounding. "Let go of the pain." As I spoke, I felt the energy from the stone grow stronger, illuminating the dark corners of the chapel. Clara's figure flickered, her face softening as she gazed at the heart-shaped stone. "I just wanted to be heard," she whispered, tears streaming down her ghostly cheeks. "I wanted justice." "Then let me help you find peace," I implored, stepping closer, feeling the warmth of the stone against my skin. Clara reached out, trembling, and as our hands touched, a rush of energy surged through the room. The shadows swirled around us, rising like a storm, but I held my ground, refusing to let go. The whispers grew louder, filling the air with voices crying out for justice. But Clara's presence remained steady, her eyes locked onto the stone. "I forgive them," she murmured, her voice breaking. "I forgive the town. I just wanted to be understood." As she spoke, the shadows began to retreat, their grip loosening around me. The whispers faded, replaced by a profound silence that enveloped the chapel. "Thank you," Clara whispered, her form glowing brighter. "You've given me the peace I sought." With that, the shadows dissipated entirely, and Clara's figure began to fade. "Remember me, Emily," she said softly, her voice a gentle breeze. "Remember my story." And just like that, she was gone, leaving behind only the heart-shaped stone, now dull and lifeless in my hands. The following morning, the town was abuzz with news. The missing townsfolk had returned, disoriented but unharmed. It seemed Clara's curse had lifted, and the air was lighter than it had been in weeks. I decided to share Clara's story with the townsfolk to ensure that no one forgot the lesson she had taught me about empathy and understanding. We gathered at the chapel, where I recounted her tale, the healer who had only wanted to help, misunderstood and mistreated. As I spoke, I noticed the townspeople listening intently, their expressions shifting from skepticism to understanding. They finally grasped the weight of Clara's story, realizing that their actions had consequences that extended beyond their own lives. From that day on, Eldridge transformed. The townsfolk came together, honoring Clara's memory by establishing a community garden in her name. They shared stories and laughter, learning to listen to one another in a way they never had before. Years passed, and while life continued in Eldridge, I often found myself visiting the chapel. It became a place of reflection, a sanctuary of understanding where people could come to share their stories, their fears, and their hopes. One night, as I stood in the chapel, I felt a familiar chill in the air. The whispers returned, but this time they were different, softer, kinder. "Thank you, Emily." I smiled, knowing that Clara's spirit would always be with us, reminding us to listen, to understand, and to find the light in even the darkest of places. And as the moon bathed the chapel in silver light, I knew that her story would live on, woven into the very fabric of Eldridge, a testament to the power of empathy and the importance of the voices we sometimes overlook. Final thoughts. The Whispering Lady's tale is a haunting reminder of the past, urging us to recognize the whispers in our own lives, those stories waiting to be told, those voices yearning to be heard. As I closed the chapel door behind me, I took a deep breath, knowing that some whispers are meant to guide us, not haunt us. Story 4: The Lost Echoes. Moving back to my grandmother's old house in the isolated town of Eldridge felt like stepping into a world frozen in time. The quaint, dilapidated structure was surrounded by dense woods that whispered secrets and tales from long ago. It was a strange comfort, this familiar space, yet an overwhelming sense of loneliness blanketed me. The town had always been a topic of strange stories and local legends, but now, those tales felt eerily close to my reality. As I settled into my new life, I found solace in sorting through my grandmother's belongings, unearthing memories that felt both comforting and haunting. Her old radio caught my attention, a relic from another era, dust-covered but still intact. Curious, I plugged it in, and to my surprise, it crackled to life. The static hummed, a soft white noise that danced through the empty room. I felt a tingle of excitement as I turned the knobs, searching for a station. But it wasn't music that filled the air, it was voices. They were faint at first, barely discernible, but as I adjusted the dial, the voices grew clearer. They sounded desperate, overlapping, as if they were all trying to speak at once. I heard snippets of phrases help me lost echoes. It was unsettling, like a ghostly chorus, and it sent chills down my spine. My grandmother had left behind a collection of handwritten notes, filled with sketches and observations about the local legends, particularly one about the lost echoes, voices from the past that could be heard at the abandoned radio tower. The notes spoke of the lost echoes, a legend that claimed those who ventured near the tower at night could hear the voices of the missing people who had disappeared without a trace over the years. The stories chilled me to the bone. I had never paid much attention to these local legends, but now they seemed to reach out from the pages, calling me to investigate. One particularly foggy evening, I made a decision. I had to visit the radio tower. The fog curled around the trees like fingers, enveloping everything in a soft white shroud. As I stepped outside, the world transformed. Familiar paths morphed into unrecognizable shadows. My heart raced, but my curiosity pushed me forward. The walk to the tower felt longer than I had anticipated, the silence punctuated only by the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. As I approached, the tower loomed above me, an ancient sentinel standing guard over the woods. Its once bright paint was now peeling, and the structure itself was riddled with rust, like a body forgotten and left to decay. I felt a mix of apprehension and excitement. This was where the echoes lingered, where the voices called out. I stepped inside the tower, the door creaking ominously as I pushed it open. The air inside was stale, heavy with dust and a sense of abandonment. I flicked on my flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness. Old machinery lay strewn across the floor, half buried under layers of dust. I could feel the weight of history pressing in on me, and I hesitated, sensing I was not alone. As I climbed the spiral staircase, the voices grew louder, their urgency palpable. I reached the top and entered the main broadcast room. A dusty control panel dominated the space, and I felt drawn to it. I wiped away the layers of grime and saw the microphone, still connected to a tangle of wires. With trembling hands, I switched on the radio. Static filled the room, and then, amidst the noise, the voices emerged once more. Help us. Lost. Echoes. They were clearer now, filled with despair. I could almost feel their fear wrapping around me, pulling me into their plight. My heart raced as I realized the power of this moment. This was my chance to uncover the mystery, to give voice to the voiceless. I grabbed my recorder, intent on capturing their pleas. "Who are you?" I shouted into the microphone, my voice trembling. "What happened to you?" The static crackled, and for a moment I thought I heard a name, Lydia. The name echoed through the room, weaving itself into the fabric of the air. Suddenly the radio emitted a loud screech, startling me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The room felt colder, and I noticed shadows flitting across the walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It was then that I noticed a flickering light outside the window. I approached, peering through the grime-covered glass. In the distance, faint figures moved through the fog, their forms indistinct and ghostly. I squinted, straining to see, but they vanished as quickly as they appeared. A sense of dread washed over me, but I was compelled to stay. I flipped through my grandmother's notes again, searching for answers. Among the scribbles, one entry stood out: "The echoes are bound to the tower. They seek release." My skin prickled with fear. What did that mean? Were these voices trapped, or was there something more sinister at play? As I delved deeper into the recordings, I noticed a pattern. Each voice told a story of betrayal, regret, or fear. I could almost visualize their last moments, trapped in a loop, reliving their final cries for help. My pulse quickened as I listened to Lydia's voice again, pleading, "Find me, before it's too late." I had to find out who Lydia was. My search led me back to town, where I talked to locals, piecing together her story. Lydia was a girl who had vanished decades ago, a child of the woods, whose laughter was said to echo through the trees. They whispered of how she had wandered too far into the forest, drawn by something she couldn't explain. The tales grew darker with every retelling, hinting at a malevolent force that resided within the woods. Among the townsfolk, I met an elderly woman named Mabel, who had lived in Eldridge her entire life. Her eyes darkened when I mentioned Lydia's name. "You shouldn't have gone to the tower," she warned, her voice trembling. "The echoes are not just voices, they are a warning. There are things in those woods that are better left undisturbed." Her words echoed in my mind as I returned to the tower that night, the fog thicker than before. The air felt electric, charged with an otherworldly energy. I gripped the radio tightly, determined to uncover the truth. As I stepped inside, a chilling breeze swept through the room, extinguishing my flashlight. I fumbled in the dark, panic rising within me. I had to keep my composure. I switched on the radio, and the static filled the air once more, but this time it felt different, hostile. The voices were louder now, their desperation morphing into something darker. Evelyn, a chilling whisper, almost a caress. "Join us." I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The room grew colder, and the shadows shifted, swirling around me like a dark storm. The radio crackled, and I saw a fleeting image of a girl, her face pale and sorrowful. "You must find the heart of the woods," she urged, her voice laced with urgency. "The echoes can only be released through the truth." Suddenly the door slammed shut, and the shadows closed in. I could feel their icy breath against my skin, pulling me into their depths. "Help us," they cried, their voices overlapping into a chorus of anguish. I stumbled backward, my heart racing as the shadows pressed in. "What do you want from me?" I screamed. "I'm not one of you." "Find Lydia," the voices howled, echoing through the tower. "Find her, or be lost with us forever." I felt the air grow heavy with despair, the darkness wrapping around me like a shroud. In that moment, I knew I had to confront whatever was in those woods, to find Lydia and uncover the truth behind the whispers. With a surge of determination, I dashed for the door, throwing it open and racing into the fog. The forest loomed ahead, its twisted trees reaching out like skeletal fingers. I plunged deeper into the woods, the fog swallowing me whole. The echoes followed, their cries guiding me, urging me forward. I could hear Lydia's voice calling to me, leading me through the maze of shadows. "Evelyn, this way." I stumbled through the underbrush, my heart pounding in my chest. The further I went, the darker it became, as if the trees themselves were closing in. The atmosphere thickened, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. But I couldn't turn back, not now. In a clearing, I spotted an ancient oak tree, its gnarled roots twisting like serpents. Beneath it, a small grave was marked by a weathered stone. I approached cautiously, my breath hitching in my throat. The inscription was barely legible: Lydia Hartwell, lost but never forgotten. My heart ached as I knelt beside the grave. "Lydia," I whispered. "Is this you?" The shadows danced around me, swirling with an unsettling energy. "Evelyn," the voices whispered, their tones shifting from anguish to a fragile hope. "You found her. Now you must listen." I closed my eyes, focusing on Lydia's presence. Memories flooded my mind, visions of a girl laughing, playing in the woods, her joy palpable. But then, darkness seeped in, shadows enveloping her, laughter turning to screams. The imagery twisted, and I could feel her fear, her desperate attempts to escape. In that moment, I understood. Lydia hadn't just vanished, she had been taken, bound to this place by the darkness lurking within the woods. I felt a surge of compassion and sorrow. I had to help her, to set her spirit free. "Lydia, I won't abandon you," I vowed, tears streaming down my face. "I'll tell your story. I'll make sure they remember you." The echoes swirled around me, their desperation morphing into a soft chorus of gratitude. "Help us. Set us free." As I spoke Lydia's name into the night, a wind swept through the clearing, carrying the whispers of the lost. The shadows flickered, as if wavering between this world and the next. The air grew heavy with anticipation, and I could sense a shift. I began to speak, my voice steady and clear. "Lydia Hartwell was lost in these woods. She deserves to be remembered. We must tell her story." Each word reverberated through the forest, sending shivers through the trees. As I recounted her laughter, her adventures, and her loss, the darkness began to recede. The air grew lighter, and the whispers transformed from sorrow to a gentle hum of peace. The shadows that had once surrounded me began to fade, as if acknowledging my vow to honor Lydia's memory. "Thank you, Evelyn," a voice echoed, softer now, filled with relief. "You freed us." The clearing brightened, and I felt a warmth envelop me. Lydia's spirit emerged, radiant and ethereal, her face now a picture of peace. "I can finally rest," she said, a smile gracing her lips. The darkness of the woods faded, replaced by a soft glow, and the echoes of the lost transformed into a harmonious melody. The weight of despair lifted, and I felt a sense of fulfillment wash over me. I had given them a voice, a chance to be remembered. As dawn broke, illuminating the forest in hues of gold, I stepped back from the grave, feeling the last remnants of the shadows fade away. I had found closure not just for Lydia, but for all the echoes trapped within the woods. Returning to the tower, I felt a profound sense of peace. The radio remained silent, a calm before a new beginning. I knew the stories of the lost would never truly disappear. They would linger in the hearts of those who chose to remember. In the weeks that followed, I shared Lydia's story with the townsfolk, reminding them of the power of memory and the importance of listening to the echoes of the past. The radio tower became a symbol of hope, a place where people gathered to tell stories and honor those who had been lost. And as for me, I embraced my role as the storyteller. Each night I would sit by the radio, listening to the whispers of the woods, a reminder of the connections that bound us all. The echoes would always be a part of me, guiding me, and in that connection I found a sense of belonging. As the sun set behind the trees, casting long shadows across the landscape, I would smile, knowing that the lost were finally at peace. The echoes had been heard, and in their stories I had discovered my own. Story 5: The Curse of Norp House. I don't believe in ghosts, spirits, or anything supernatural, but that night was weird. It was my senior year of high school, and my two friends, Nick and Noah, and I had a weekend ritual exploring any supposedly haunted place we could find. We'd scour the internet for lists of local ghost stories and creepy spots, ticking them off one by one. Most were disappointing, just urban legends or strange coincidences. There was a forest where a light appeared at a specific time in the night. We never saw it. There was a bridge where you were supposed to honk at midnight, flash your headlights 3 times, and something magical would happen. Nothing ever did. Then, we saw a name at the bottom of the list, the Norp House. Apparently, it was once a plantation house. When Union soldiers came to free the slaves, the owner hung them from the trees surrounding the property rather than let them go. Over time, the house had fallen into disrepair, with just enough updates to make it livable before it was abandoned for good. The stories warned of dark shadows and whispers in the wind, a place where the past refused to die. After some debate, we decided to explore the house. Nick, always the skeptic, had reluctantly agreed. "It's just an old house," he said, shrugging. "Nothing's going to happen." Noah and I shared a look. We knew he was just trying to appear tough, but we all felt that tingle of excitement mixed with apprehension. As the weekend rolled around, we gathered our flashlights, snacks, and the obligatory Ouija board, a prop for our daring adventure. Around 3 a.m., we packed into my Pontiac Bonneville for the 30-minute drive to the house. The rain was light but steady, the kind that settles into your bones, and the roads were dead. I knew it was 3 a.m., but we saw not a single car. The house was set back from the road, gated off, with only a small gravel lot nearby where we could park. It seemed like a maintenance area for the adjacent railroad. The lot was clearly visible from the road, and we joked nervously about how easy it would be for a cop to see my car and suspect we were up to no good. Still, we had no other choice but to park there. The first thing we noticed was the gate, or rather, what was left of it. 2 brick pillars flanked the entrance to a long, overgrown dirt driveway. Whatever gate had once been there was gone, replaced by 3 cement blocks that made it impossible for cars to pass through. We climbed over them, officially stepping onto the Norp property. The online list had called these brick pillars the gates to hell, claiming they had some mystical effect on anyone who walked through. I didn't feel anything supernatural, just the chill of a damp October night. As we continued down the path, the woods grew thicker, and without our flashlights we would have been lost. The trail was barely visible, and we kept stumbling, losing our footing in the mud. After what felt like hours of navigating through the trees, we reached a shallow creek. I crossed easily, thankful for my waterproof boots, but Noah, who'd worn slides of all things, cursed under his breath as he waded through. Just when we started doubting whether we were even on the right path, I shined my flashlight ahead, and there it was. A massive white wall loomed out of the darkness, so sudden and imposing that it made my heart skip a beat. The house seemed to have materialized out of nowhere, its decrepit form nearly swallowed by the overgrowth. The roof had partially collapsed, scattering debris across the yard, and part of the basement wall had caved in, exposing its insides. A rusty air vent dangled precariously from the basement ceiling, creaking in the wind. We approached the house cautiously, circling around the side in search of the front door. The property was so overgrown that we felt like we were trekking through a forest, vines and thorns tugging at our clothes. Then we heard it. A faint shuffling sound just ahead of us. We froze, exchanging uneasy glances. It was the kind of sound that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up, as if something or someone was stirring in the basement, now accessible through the broken-down wall. My first thought was that a homeless person had taken up residence in the house, and we were about to trespass on their territory. I knew it wasn't a ghost, but I thought it was either a guy or a deer about to charge me. "Back up," I whispered, motioning for Nick and Noah to retreat. We all backed a few feet, then stood still, straining our ears, and the shuffling sound grew louder. The wind had died completely, and yet the noise continued. "Is that a guy? Or an animal?" I called into the darkness, gripping my pocket knife tightly. In retrospect, it was a dumb question. I mean, what was I expecting? An animal to answer, "Hey, yeah, I'm just a raccoon." Still, the tension was palpable, and I wasn't taking any chances. I edged forward, my knife at the ready, the shuffling sound intensifying with every step I took. One step closer. Another. And then I saw the terrifying creature responsible for all the noise. An armadillo. The three of us relaxed, the tension evaporating as quickly as it had come. We inspected the little fella just minding its business and decided to leave it be and not explore the basement. We continued our trek around the house, finally reaching the front door. There wasn't actually a door there, but I assumed that's where the door was supposed to be. Inside, the house was even worse than we'd imagined. The floors were covered in shattered glass, walls battered as if someone had gone at them with a sledgehammer. Graffiti covered the few walls that remained, some of it surprisingly artistic, some of it just messy tags. The layout was straightforward: 4 rooms on the bottom floor, 4 on the top. The 4th room on the bottom floor was completely caved in. The floor had collapsed, creating a hole that led straight down into the basement. The floor above was in nearly as bad a shape as the one below, so we decided to steer clear of that area and head upstairs instead. We passed the stairs leading to the basement. Well, I guess they weren't stairs, as there were none, just a sheer drop. I was relieved I had my flashlight. Without it, I might have missed the 9-foot drop onto the rubble and concrete below. The stairs up were steep and creaky, their worn carpet treads barely clinging on. Upstairs, the back left room contained remnants from previous explorers, a grill and a few beer cans. I guess the people before us were much less creeped out than we were. Eventually, we finally reached the master bedroom, essentially 2 rooms without a separating wall. The room was empty, covered in graffiti, and still without any furniture. At this point, no ghosts had shown themselves, so we decided to bring out the big guns, a Ouija board. Nick had brought it along, and we set it up in the middle of the room. I placed my phone leaning on the support pillar in the middle of the room, providing light and filming the session. We gathered around the board, placed our hands on the planchette, the Ouija triangle thing, and began the ritual. The first question we asked was, "Is anyone there?" To our shock, the planchette began moving. We were all adamant we weren't moving it. I still talk to Nick all the time, and he still promises that he was not moving it. And Noah also promises it wasn't him the last times we talked about it. The answers it spelled out were nonsensical random letters and numbers that didn't make any sense. We kept asking questions and we would keep getting random letters as answers. We were about to call it quits. Then Noah decided to ask, "Are you the owner or are you SLA?" Before he could even finish his question, the light from my phone abruptly shut off, plunging us into darkness. It took a moment for me to switch on my other light, and when I checked my phone, I found that the battery was completely dead. I had charged it fully before we left, so I still don't know how it happened. We sat there, feelings of fear and confusion fighting for power. Breaking the silence, Noah suggested that maybe supernatural entities feed off electrical power. It really didn't make us feel any better, and I didn't buy into that anyway. After the Ouija board and the unsettling phone blackout, we decided it was best to cut our exploration short. I didn't want to risk having my car spotted by the police, so we quickly packed up our things and made our way back downstairs. As we passed the gaping hole leading to the basement, the graffiti, and the destroyed walls, the cold autumn rain hit us again as we stepped outside. We made our way back to the rear of the house, glancing back at our armadillo friend, who seemed to have found shelter from the rain among the remains of the basement. As we made our way through the trashed rear of the house, the silence was suddenly shattered by the roar of an engine. The sound was coming from the direction where I had parked the car. There shouldn't have been anyone else there, but as we turned, the headlights of a large pickup truck broke through the thick brush. We were paralyzed with fear as the truck approached, the engine revving loudly as it grew closer. "Guys, we've got to hide," I hissed, pulling the two of them behind a large tree just in time to see the truck pull up near my car. A man in a stained work shirt climbed out, followed by another man who looked like he'd just rolled out of bed. They both glanced around, their shadows stretching long in the headlights. "Dude, what should we do?" Nick whispered. I could feel my heart racing. Should we risk getting caught and explain ourselves, or should we stay hidden? "I think we should stay put," I decided, though it felt like a coward's choice. The men stepped closer to my car, inspecting it and whispering to one another. The tension in the air was palpable. Then one of them pointed right at our hiding spot. My heart sank. They were close enough that if we didn't act, they could discover us. We had to leave. Now I whispered sharply, pushing the others as quietly as I could away from the tree and deeper into the underbrush. As we ducked into the shadows, the men began to walk toward the back of the house, and I thought I could hear one of them mutter, "Let's check the old Norp house." In that moment, I didn't feel like a ghost hunter anymore. I felt like a thief caught in the act. We quickly moved away from the house, creeping around the overgrown bushes as we made our way back toward the gravel lot where my car was parked. Just as we reached the edge of the lot, I froze. The pickup truck was now backed up to block the exit from the gravel. "We can't go back," I breathed. The rain poured down, drenching us, and we huddled behind my car, breathless and terrified. "Do you think they saw us?" Noah whispered. "What if they come after us?" "Let's just stay calm," I said. "Maybe they'll just leave." But the men were still inside the truck, their voices muffled by the downpour. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but every second felt like an eternity. Then one of them suddenly got out of the truck again and slammed the door behind him. I barely had time to react before he began walking toward the edge of the lot, a flashlight in hand. "Shit," Nick hissed, and I grabbed their arms, pulling them further back, away from the edge of the lot and toward the thick trees. The man kept shining his flashlight around, and I prayed he wouldn't catch a glimpse of us. He scanned the area, his beam cutting through the darkness, but somehow we remained hidden. But then something caught my eye, a flicker of movement in the trees. I turned just in time to see the armadillo we had encountered earlier scuttling across the lot, heading straight for the man with the flashlight. "Are you kidding me?" I gasped, and before I could even think, the man spotted the creature and took off after it, calling out to his friend in the truck. "Let's go," now I urged, and we darted toward the trees. We plunged deeper into the darkness, adrenaline pumping as we sprinted away from the truck, the sound of footsteps growing fainter behind us. We ran until we reached the creek again, panting and soaked through. I didn't stop to think, just leapt across the water, landing heavily on the opposite bank. Nick and Noah followed suit, and for a moment we just stood there, trying to catch our breath. "I can't believe we got caught," Nick said, his voice shaky. "This was supposed to be fun." "Yeah, fun, until we almost got caught by a couple of hillbillies," Noah replied. But as we turned back to the house, something shifted in the atmosphere. The rain continued to fall, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The shadows seemed to creep closer, and the wind picked up, rustling the trees as if they were whispering secrets. I glanced at the house one last time, and as I did, I swear I saw a figure standing in the window on the second floor, pale, with dark hair hanging around its face. My blood ran cold. "Guys, did you see that?" I stammered, pointing up at the window. "What?" Nick asked, peering into the darkness. "There was someone in there," I said, my voice rising in pitch. "I swear." "Come on. It's just the shadows," Nick insisted. "We need to go." But something deep inside me knew we weren't alone, that the darkness of the Norp house was alive with memories and secrets we could never understand. The feeling of dread tightened around my chest as we turned away from the house and started back toward my car. Once we got to my car, I didn't even bother to think about what could be following us. I just wanted to get out of there. Nick jumped into the passenger seat, and Noah slid into the back. I slammed the car into gear, and we sped away from the Norp house, leaving the darkness behind. But even as we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't escaped. The rain pounded on the windshield, the wipers struggling to keep up. With each mile that passed, the tension inside the car grew. "What a disaster," Noah muttered, shaking his head. "I thought this would be fun. All we did was freak ourselves out." "Next time, let's just stick to the bridge," Nick added. "At least there aren't any rednecks out there." I forced a laugh, but inside I felt unsettled. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the pickup truck following us. "Do you think they'll come after us?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Who cares?" Nick said dismissively. "We're fine. It's not like they'll know who we are. Just forget about it." But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The road was empty, a dark ribbon snaking through the trees, and just as I thought we were finally safe, I saw it. In the rearview mirror, a figure stood at the edge of the road, shrouded in shadows. I slammed on the brakes, heart racing as I turned to Nick and Noah. "Did you see that?" I gasped. "What? What did you see?" Nick replied, alarmed. "There was someone standing there," I insisted, my breath coming in quick gasps. Noah leaned closer, peering out the window. "I don't see anything," he said, shaking his head. But I felt it again, the eyes on me, the weight of something watching. "Let's just go," I urged, my voice trembling as I shifted into gear again. But as I started to drive away, I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror again. It was there, lingering in the shadows, the pale figure from the house. "Keep driving," Nick shouted, panic setting in as I pressed the gas pedal harder. The road ahead was dark, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was following us. The air felt thick, electric with something I couldn't quite name. Just as we rounded a bend, the engine sputtered and died, leaving us stranded in the darkness. The car coasted to a stop, and I could feel the weight of fear pressing down on us as we sat there in silence. "What now?" Nick asked, his voice a mix of dread and disbelief. "I don't know," I snapped, trying to force back the panic rising in my chest. "Maybe we should get out and check the engine." But deep down, I knew it was a bad idea. The darkness outside felt suffocating, like it was pressing in on us. I glanced back through the rear window, half expecting to see the figure standing there. "Maybe we should call someone," Noah suggested, pulling out his phone. "Great idea," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let me guess you have no service." He shook his head, frustration etched across his face. "No, I don't. You." I checked my phone again, nothing. The battery was dead, but it still wouldn't turn on. "Of course not," I muttered, slumping back in my seat. Just then, a sudden noise broke the silence, the sound of something scraping against the car. My heart raced as I turned, peering out the windows, trying to see through the darkness. "What was that?" Nick whispered, fear creeping into his voice. "I don't know," I said, my voice rising in panic. "It's probably just a branch." But then I saw it. A pale figure loomed at the edge of the tree line, just outside the reach of the headlights. My breath caught in my throat as I stared, transfixed. It looked like the figure I had seen in the window earlier, its long hair hanging limply over its face. "Guys, we need to go now," I shouted, my heart pounding as I fumbled for the door handle. "What?" "Are you crazy?" Nick yelled, grabbing my arm. "Don't open that door." But I didn't listen. I threw the door open and leapt out into the rain, the cold water hitting my skin like ice. "We have to run," I shouted, already sprinting toward the tree line. The others hesitated but quickly followed, the sound of our pounding feet echoing in the silence. As we plunged into the darkness, I could hear the wind howling around us, mingling with the sound of our ragged breaths. The trees loomed overhead, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. I felt like we were being swallowed whole. We ran deeper into the woods, the rain drenching us completely, making it hard to see. But the feeling of being followed was inescapable. It was like the darkness was alive, and something was waiting for us just out of sight. "What if we can't find our way back?" Noah shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "We will," I insisted, pushing forward, desperate to escape whatever had been haunting us. But the deeper we went, the more lost I felt. The trees began to look the same, twisting and turning like a maze, and the oppressive weight of the darkness closed in around us. Suddenly I heard a rustling behind us, and I stopped short. "Did you hear that?" "Yeah," Nick said, fear creeping into his voice. "What was that?" Before I could answer, the figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the weak light filtering through the trees. It was the same woman I had seen in the window, her hair hanging like a veil over her face, her clothes soaked and torn. "Get back," I screamed, stumbling back as the figure took a step closer. But she didn't seem aggressive, she just stood there, her head tilted as if listening. "What does she want?" Nick asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, my heart racing. The woman raised a hand, and I felt a chill wash over me. It was as if the temperature dropped several degrees, and the air around us felt electric. "Please," I said, my voice shaking. We didn't mean any harm. We just wanted to see the house. Her head tilted further, and for a moment I felt a connection, as if she were trying to communicate. "Do you need help?" I ventured, and to my shock, she nodded slowly. Suddenly, images flooded my mind, memories of the Norp house, a family torn apart, a spirit trapped between worlds. I could see flashes of a life once lived, laughter echoing in the halls, but it was all twisted and darkened by grief and loss. "You're trapped here," I said, realization dawning on me. "You want us to help you?" She nodded again, and in that moment I understood the weight of her sorrow. She wasn't trying to harm us, she was trying to find peace. But then I felt a surge of fear. "What do you want us to do?" Her gaze intensified, and I felt an overwhelming urge to act. "We'll help you," I promised, my heart racing as I reached out toward her. But just as I did, she let out a piercing wail that echoed through the woods, sending shivers down my spine. The sound was filled with pain, and I realized too late that we had crossed a line. Before I could react, the darkness around us surged. Shadows twisted and turned, forming into ghostly figures that swirled around us, their whispers filling the air. "Run," I yelled, pulling Noah and Nick with me as we stumbled back through the trees. The shadows were closing in, and I felt the weight of their sorrow pressing down on us. "Where do we go?" Nick shouted, panic rising in his voice. "Back to the road," I yelled, pushing forward. But the shadows were relentless, clawing at us as we ran. I could hear their whispers growing louder, a chorus of mournful wails that filled the air. The forest felt alive with their grief, and I knew we had awakened something we couldn't control. As we burst into the clearing where my car had died, I turned to see the shadows gathering around us. "We need to get inside," I screamed, lunging for the door. But as I fumbled with a handle, I felt a chill wash over me. The woman's figure stood at the edge of the clearing, her eyes filled with anguish. "Wait," I called out, desperation flooding my voice. "We're trying to help you." But the shadows surged forward, and the woman stepped back, her form becoming less defined. "No," I shouted, reaching out toward her. "Get in the car," Nick yelled, pulling me inside as the shadows closed in around us. I slammed the door, heart pounding as the whispers intensified. "Start the engine," Noah cried, panic seeping into his voice. I turned the key, and the engine sputtered to life. I couldn't believe it. Somehow we were still here. I hit the gas, the tires spinning as we broke free from the darkness. The shadows swirled behind us, but as we drove away, the whispers faded into the night. I glanced back, catching a final glimpse of the woman standing in the clearing, her form illuminated by the headlights. I felt a pang of regret as we sped away, knowing we had disturbed a peace that had been long lost. We drove for miles, the weight of what had happened settling in. The rain had finally stopped, but the night felt heavier than ever. "What the hell was that?" Nick asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I replied, my heart still racing. "But I think we need to go back." "What? Are you insane?" Noah exclaimed. "We just escaped." "No," I insisted, feeling a strange pull toward the Norp house. "I can't just leave her like that. She needs our help." "But what if she's a real spirit?" Nick argued. "What if she wants revenge?" "I don't think so," I said, my voice firm. "I think she just wants peace." As we drove in silence, I could feel the gravity of my decision weighing on me. The image of the woman lingered in my mind, and I knew we had to go back, if only to set things right. When we finally reached the Norp house, the sun was rising, casting a golden light over the old structure. It looked different in the daylight, less ominous and more like a home that had once been filled with life. "Are you sure about this?" Noah asked, his voice small. "I have to do this," I replied, feeling a sense of purpose wash over me. We stepped out of the car and approached the house, the air thick with anticipation. As we walked up the porch steps, I felt the weight of history pressing down on us. "Let's find her," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. We entered the house, and the memories flooded back: the laughter, the sorrow, the love. The air felt electric, charged with a sense of longing. "Where do we start?" Nick asked, glancing around nervously. "Maybe the second floor," I suggested, recalling the figure I had seen earlier. We climbed the creaky stairs, the sound echoing in the stillness. As we reached the top, I felt a pull toward the room at the end of the hall. "Here," I said, pushing the door open. Inside, the sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, illuminating the room filled with forgotten memories. The walls were lined with faded photographs, and in the center stood an old rocking chair that creaked softly. "Is this where she lived?" Noah whispered, awed. "I think so," I said, moving closer to the rocking chair. "It feels familiar." As I reached out to touch the chair, a sudden chill swept through the room, and I knew she was here. The air felt heavy with emotion, and I closed my eyes, focusing on the connection. "Can you hear me?" I whispered, my voice trembling. For a moment there was silence, but then I felt a rush of warmth surround me, a presence filled with sorrow and longing. "We want to help you," I said, tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. "We're here for you." The rocking chair began to sway gently, and I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The memories flooded my mind, and I could see glimpses of the woman's life, laughter, love, and the tragedy that had trapped her here. "I'm sorry for what happened," I said, my voice breaking. "You deserve peace." The air shifted, and I felt a release, as if the weight of the world had been lifted. Suddenly, the room filled with a soft glow, and I knew she was ready to move on. "Thank you," a voice whispered, echoing in my mind. As the warmth enveloped me, I felt a surge of love and gratitude, and in that moment, I knew we had set her free. Epilogue: the Knorp House. We left the house, the sun shining brightly overhead, and as we drove away, I felt a sense of closure. The Knorp House stood tall and proud behind us, a testament to a life once lived. "Did you feel that?" Nick asked, glancing back at the house. "Yeah," I said, smiling through my tears. "I think she finally found her peace." As we drove in silence, I couldn't shake the thoughts swirling in my mind. This journey had begun as a thrill-seeking adventure, a way to chase the adrenaline rush of the unknown. But what had unfolded before us was so much deeper than any ghost story or urban legend. I realized that the fear I had initially felt was only a small part of a larger narrative, one filled with pain, loss, and ultimately healing. Reflecting on the woman we had encountered, I thought about the weight of her sorrow and the isolation she must have endured. I had seen her not as a ghost, but as a soul trapped between worlds, desperate for connection and understanding. I couldn't help but wonder how many others lived with their burdens in silence, unseen and unheard. "This experience has changed me," I finally said, breaking the silence. "I've realized that there's so much more to fear than just the darkness. It's the stories we carry, the regrets, and the things we leave unresolved that can haunt us the most." Noah nodded, his expression contemplative. "It makes you think about the choices we make and how they affect those around us. We're all connected, even in ways we don't see." "Exactly," I replied, feeling a sense of camaraderie. "We often focus on our fears, but this has taught me the importance of empathy. We need to understand each other's struggles, to help one another find closure, just as we did for her." As we continued driving, the landscape around us transformed, the dark woods giving way to open fields bathed in sunlight. It felt like a symbolic rebirth, a fresh start after the chaos we had just experienced. I found myself thinking about the things I wanted to change in my own life. I had often held back, afraid of facing my own demons, but now I understood that confronting them could lead to liberation. We should share our story, I suggested. Not just the spooky parts, but everything we learned about understanding and compassion. Maybe it will help someone else. Nick smiled, the tension of the night easing from his shoulders. Yeah, that's a great idea. There's power in storytelling and sharing our experiences. As we drove onward, I felt a newfound sense of purpose. This journey had been more than just an exploration of the haunted. It had been a journey into the depths of my own fears and emotions. I had faced the darkness, not just of the Knorp house, but within myself, and emerged stronger. By confronting the unknown, I realized that I was not alone in my struggles. We all carry our burdens, and sometimes all it takes is a little courage to connect with others and help lighten the load. As the sun set on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I felt a weight lift from my heart. The experience had taught me that the only way to find peace is to help others find theirs. In that moment, I knew that I would carry these lessons with me for the rest of my life, forging deeper connections with those around me and embracing the power of empathy. The Knorp house would remain forever etched in our memories, a haunting reminder of a night filled with terror, but also with hope, love, and the power of connection. And as we ventured into the future, I felt ready to face whatever awaited us, knowing that we had the strength to confront our fears together. Story 6: The Whispers of Hollow Hill. I wasn't a believer, but I wasn't exactly a skeptic either. Let's say I liked keeping an open mind about the world. Life was more fun when you left room for the unexplained. I wasn't the type to watch ghost hunting shows or obsess over urban legends, but I found them entertaining. Hollow Hill, though, that place had always felt like more than just a story to me. I couldn't explain why, but whenever I passed those woods, an odd chill would creep up my spine, like I was being watched. So when my friends Jake, Sarah, and Emily decided we should camp out there one summer night, I didn't hesitate. Hell, why not? I shrugged when they asked if I was in. It was just another weekend adventure, and I loved the thrill of getting spooked, even if it never really amounted to much. I had no reason to believe this trip would be any different. Boy, was I wrong. We arrived at Hollow Hill as the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the towering trees that marked the edge of the woods. The place had an unsettling beauty about it, quiet, eerie, and utterly still. There were no chirping birds or buzzing insects, just the wind sighing through the branches. It was weird, but I chalked it up to the usual creepiness that came with isolated spots like this. Perfect night for some ghost stories, Sarah grinned, setting up the tent. Jake laughed, shaking his head. If you start talking about the crying lady again, I'm out. The crying mother, Emily corrected, her voice low. That's what they call her. She lost her children, and now she searches for them, crying and calling their names. And anyone who hears her cry is supposed to disappear, just like they did. Come on, Em, I teased, tossing my sleeping bag into the tent. You really think we're going to hear some ghost crying out here? If anything, we'll get freaked out by an owl or something. But I couldn't ignore the creeping sensation that settled in my chest. I always had this weird instinct for danger. It wasn't like I thought anything supernatural would happen, but something about this place set me on edge. I wasn't about to tell them that, though. I had a reputation to uphold as the unflappable one in the group, the guy who wasn't afraid of anything. By the time we built the fire and settled in for the night, the stars hung above us like distant sparks, and the temperature had dropped. A lot. I huddled closer to the fire, feeling the cold seep through my clothes. The others seemed oblivious, laughing and chatting as if nothing felt off. Eventually, the conversation turned back to the legends of Hollow Hill. Sarah, ever the drama queen, took the opportunity to recount the ghost story she had been telling since we were kids, the one about the crying mother who wandered the woods searching for her lost children. According to her, people who disappeared around here had been lured by the sound of her sobbing. "Do you hear that?" Emily asked suddenly, her voice just above a whisper. We all froze, listening intently. At first I thought she was messing with us, but then I heard it too, a soft, distant noise carried on the wind. It wasn't crying, exactly, but more like a whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Probably just the wind," Jake said, though his voice didn't sound as confident as usual. "Yeah," I agreed, forcing a grin. The wind always sounds like whispers when it cuts through the trees. But my heart was racing. The noise was too distinct to be wind. I kept my face neutral, refusing to let on that something was crawling under my skin. I didn't like to admit fear. I wasn't built like that. Life was short, and I wasn't about to waste it on irrational worries or fear of things I couldn't explain. "Let's check it out," Sarah suggested, standing up and dusting off her pants. "Bad idea," I muttered. My instincts were screaming at me to stay by the fire, but Sarah was already heading toward the trees, flashlight in hand. "I'll go," Jake said, grabbing his own flashlight and trailing after her. "It's probably just an animal. I don't want her freaking out alone." Emily gave me a questioning look. "Aren't you going with them?" I hesitated. Normally I'd jump at the chance to play the brave one, but tonight, something was wrong. "Nah, someone's got to watch the camp," I said casually, tossing another log on the fire. But as soon as Jake and Sarah disappeared into the trees, the air around us seemed to thicken. Emily sat closer to me, her eyes darting nervously into the woods. I could feel the tension radiating off her, and I was glad I wasn't alone. Minutes passed, then more. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and that damn whispering, which seemed to be getting louder, circling us like a chant. "I don't like this," Emily said under her breath. I didn't respond. My senses were on high alert, my muscles coiled, ready to spring up at any moment. Something was wrong, more wrong than I could explain. It felt like the forest was alive, watching us, waiting for something to happen. Then, without warning, we heard footsteps approaching. Heavy, rushed footsteps. I jumped up, flashlight in hand, pointing it toward the sound. Jake emerged from the trees, but his face, something was off. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated, and he was breathing hard. "Jake, or Sarah?" I asked, panic rising in my throat. She's still out there," he stammered. "I heard her crying, but I couldn't find her. She just disappeared." "What do you mean she disappeared?" I snapped, grabbing his arm. "Where is she?" Jake shook his head, eyes wild with fear. "I don't know. One second she was right behind me, and the next, I heard her scream, and then nothing. She's gone." I didn't wait. I grabbed my flashlight and ran toward the trees, my heart pounding in my ears. The whispering was louder now, surrounding me like a cacophony of voices. "Sarah," I shouted into the darkness. "Sarah." No answer. I pushed deeper into the woods, branches slapping at my face, the cold seeping into my bones. And then I heard it. Soft, broken sobbing. It was unmistakable. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't my imagination. It was her. "Sarah." "Sarah," I shouted, shining the light in every direction. I followed the sound, my breath catching in my throat as the trees closed in around me. The sobbing grew louder, closer, until I was certain she was just ahead. I burst into a small clearing, and that's when I saw her. She was standing in the middle of the clearing, her back to me, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. "Sarah," I called out, approaching slowly. Are you okay?" But something was wrong. Her sobbing sounded off, hollow. I hesitated, keeping my distance. "Sarah." She turned slowly, her face pale in the moonlight. But it wasn't Sarah. It looked like her. But the eyes were wrong, blank, glassy, like a doll's, and her lips, they didn't move with the sound of the sobbing. It wasn't coming from her at all. I took a step back, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But then I heard it again, louder this time, the whispers. They weren't coming from the wind. They were coming from a wind. I froze. The thing that looked like Sarah tilted its head, the blank eyes never leaving mine. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, wrapping around me like cold tendrils. They weren't just random sounds anymore, they were saying something. Words, familiar words, my name. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my grip, its beams spinning wildly across the trees. I could feel the cold sweat rolling down my spine, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was rooted in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure in front of me. "Sarah," I croaked, my voice barely above a whisper. She took a step forward, the ground seeming to shift beneath her feet, as if she wasn't walking on solid earth anymore. The sobbing grew louder, echoing in my head, until it felt like my skull would split open. The whispers intensified, overlapping each other in a chaotic jumble of voices. "You left me," the thing whispered, its voice distorted, as though 100 voices spoke in unison. "You left me to die." I shook my head, backing away. No, I didn't. You're not real. You're not Sarah." But the figure kept moving closer, its face shifting, warping into something grotesque and unrecognizable. The sobbing turned to laughter, cold, mocking laughter that sent chills down my spine. I stumbled, tripping over a root, and fell hard onto the ground. Pain shot through my leg, but I didn't care. I scrambled backward, away from the thing, away from the thing, away from the whispers that seemed to be closing in on me from every direction. "Please," I shouted, my voice cracking with desperation. "Sarah, if you're in there, come back. Don't do this." The thing stopped, its head cocking to the side in an eerie, unnatural way. For a moment the whispers faded, and the forest fell deathly silent. I held my breath, hope flickering weakly in my chest. Maybe, just maybe, I could get through to her. But then it smiled. A twisted, inhuman smile that stretched too wide across its face. "You were too late," it whispered, the words dripping with malice. "She's gone. And now so are you." Before I could react, the figure lunged at me, its hands outstretched, cold fingers brushing against my skin. The world spun, darkness swallowing me whole. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick, suffocating, the whispers filling my ears until they were all I could hear. My vision blurred, and I felt myself slipping away, drowning in the cold, in the dark, in the horror of it all. And then, nothing. I woke up to the sound of birds chirping, the morning light filtering through the trees. The fire had long since burned out, leaving only the faintest wisps of smoke curling into the air. My body ached all over, my head pounding as if it had been crushed in a vise. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or what had happened. And then, like a flood, it all came back. Sarah. Jake, the whispers. I sat up with a gasp, my heart racing, eyes darting around the campsite. Jake was there, lying beside the cold fire pit, still fast asleep. Emily was nowhere to be seen. And Sarah. My stomach twisted into knots. I stood up shakily, calling out their names, hoping, praying that it had all been a nightmare. But the eerie stillness of the forest was the only response. Hollow Hill was quiet, too quiet, as if the world had been drained of life. The whispers were gone, but their memory lingered, haunting the silence. I searched for hours. For Sarah, for Emily, for any sign of what had happened. But there was nothing. No footprints, no torn clothing, no broken branches. It was as if they had been erased from existence. By the time Jake woke up, dazed and confused, we both knew the truth: we weren't going to find them. I've spent years trying to make sense of what happened that night. I've scoured every piece of folklore, every ghost story, every legend about Hollow Hill, but none of them come close to explaining the horrors we experienced. Jake refuses to talk about it, burying himself in work, pretending like it never happened. But I can't forget. Every time I close my eyes, I hear the whispers. They've become a part of me now, a constant reminder that there are things in this world we're not meant to understand. I've replayed that night over and over in my mind, wondering what I could have done differently. Maybe if I hadn't let Sarah wander off, if I'd been quicker, if I hadn't frozen in fear. But the truth is, I don't think anything I did would have changed the outcome. There was something out there in those woods, something ancient and malevolent, and once it had its sights set on us, there was no escape. The hardest part is living with the uncertainty. Did we really see what we think we saw? Was it all in our heads, some kind of shared hallucination brought on by fear and suggestion? I used to believe in rational explanations, that everything had a cause, a reason. But now I'm not so sure. The only thing I know for certain is that Sarah and Emily are gone, and whatever took them, it's still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. I've thought about going back, about returning to Hollow Hill to find answers, but I can't bring myself to do it. Not yet, anyway. Maybe one day, when the whispers aren't so loud in my ears. Maybe one day, when I'm ready to face whatever it is that haunts those woods. Until then, I'll carry the weight of that night with me, a constant reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't the monsters we imagine, but the ones we can't explain. As we reach the end of tonight's stories on Hauntales, it's time to let your mind drift away. Listen to the sound of the rain gently falling in the background. Let each drop calm your thoughts and ease you into a peaceful sleep. There's nothing to fear now, just the soothing rhythm of the rain. Focus on your breathing, let your body relax, and allow yourself to drift deeper into rest. Sleep peacefully, and we'll meet again tomorrow night for another story. Good night.